Imagine that one day all the companies who make fighting games got together and decided that the genre was getting stale and needed something to shake things up a bit. After much discussion and deliberation, it was decided that, in the future, fighting games ought to have a mechanic where every time your character moved, there would be a random chance they'd slip and fall, allowing your opponent to get in a free hit or two. Now, anyone who knows anything about fighting games knows that this would be an absolutely terrible mechanic. Fighting games provide what is perhaps the purest test of personal skill there is, so introducing this kind of random element would wreak havoc on tournaments and other forms of high-level play. Well, this is how I feel about the introduction of the dialogue wheel to RPGs. This mechanic is one of those things that makes the genre worse in nearly every way while providing almost no benefit whatsoever. It's such a terrible idea, one so utterly ill-conceived, that I am endlessly grateful that it's largely died off. In the earliest RPGs, dialogue choices are often simple keywords such as job or shop. Later, in games such as Baldur's Gate or Fallout, choosing dialogue options meant selecting a line of text indicating exactly what your character was going to say, and conversations typically followed a branching tree of statements and responses. And in these games, the protagonist was typically unvoiced. Now, some people say that having a silent protagonist was a result of technical limitations, but this is not true. CD-ROM technology allowed for full voice acting even as far back as the days of MS-DOS, so the decision to make Garion's Ward or the Vault Dweller or the Nameless One a silent protagonist was a deliberate one on the developer's part. Quality voice acting isn't cheap, and having a complicated dialogue system means that your voice actors will have to cover a large number of possible responses. In the original Fallout, for example, the Vault Dweller would get different dialogue options if they had a low intelligence score or had a sufficient rank in certain skills. Since the protagonist of Fallout is unvoiced, adding these new options was simply a matter of adding the additional text into the dialogue tree. But imagine what it would be like if they were voiced. The developers would have to record the low intelligence lines, the regular lines, and the high skill level lines. And since the Vault Dweller can be either male or female, this would mean doubling the amount of recorded lines. One of my favorite RPGs is 2004's Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, and what's notable about the game is that if you play as a Malkavian vampire, you get entirely different dialogue options than if you had played as another clan. The defining quality of Malkavians is that they are all incurably insane, and thus their dialogue is generally unhinged. Now, imagine if the protagonist were voice acted. You'd have to record hundreds of lines of additional dialogue just for one clan, and that's going to cost you money. In that case, it's much simpler and cheaper to simply give every player the same 2 or 3 options, and thus a voice protagonist usually means losing out on dialogue choices. What's worse, it also takes a part of the player character away from the player. Western RPGs derive heavily from tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons, and in those games it's the norm for the player to create their own characters instead of ones made by someone else. Now, how a character talks, their accent, their cadence, the timbre of their voice, all says something about them. Actors like Morgan Freeman or Patrick Stewart have voices that resonate with authority, and thus they are often cast in the roles of authority figures. The late Tony Jay and Christopher Lee had voices that oozed villainy, and so it should not come as a surprise that they were often cast as villains. So when a game developer imposes a voice on the player character, you're sort of stealing part of the fun of character creation away from the player. I always felt that male Shepard in Mass Effect sounded like a bit of a dork no matter what options I chose, so I wound up having to play as Fem Shep because she sounded more like whatever character I had in mind. Really, the only time that having a voice actor protagonist works in an RPG is with someone like Geralt in the Witcher games. Geralt is not the player's character. He belongs to the developers and to author Andrzej Sapkowski. You don't get to pick his name, his appearance, his backstory, or his general personality. You can guide him down one path or another, but Geralt is forever Geralt. The whole thing's immutably decreed. And as far as I'm concerned, the dialogue wheel is inextricably linked to voiced protagonists. It first made its appearance in BioWare's Mass Effect, released in 2007. The mechanics of it were rather simple. The responses on the left side were usually questions or requests for information, while the right side was for replies. The topmost choice was the Paragon option, meaning something diplomatic or conciliatory. The middle option was the neutral reply, and the bottom option was for the renegade responses, which meant something aggressive or ruthless. The advantage of this system, and the only advantage from what I can tell, was that by separating questions from responses, you could give the player the choice between having an in-depth conversation or simply saying what needs to be said without having to deal with a bunch of expository dialogue, and BioWare evidently loved this system so much that they brought it into their Dragon Age games. Not coincidentally, this also marked the shift from Dragon Age games going from silent protagonists to a voiced one. But it wasn't just BioWare, of course. Games like Fallout 4, while not arranging their dialogue options in a wheel, still used a very similar system wherein the player simply chose a category of response rather than the actual response itself. And this really sucks because the dialogue wheel is awful. I distinctly recall one playthrough of Mass Effect 1 where my goal was to choose a mixture of Paragon and Renegade responses, but eventually I just gave up and went Paragon, because every time I chose a Renegade response there was a distinct possibility that Shepard would end up saying something racist. I wanted my Shepard to have a ruthless streak, sure, but that didn't extend to him being Space MAGA. If you choose to play as a Renegade Shepard, then you simply have to accept that some of your responses will be racist, unless you've somehow memorized whichever options on the dialogue wheel lead to these lines and can thus avoid selecting them. You see, the problem is that dialogue wheels typically hide the spoken response behind a paraphrase that only vaguely resembles what your character will actually say. If I had to guess as to the reason for this, it's that developers either decided or determined through playtesting that players wouldn't want to read a line of dialogue and then hear it read back to them, but the result is that you get a serious disconnect between the player and their character. In a tabletop game, when the DM asks me what my character says, then I tell them exactly what they say. Now imagine that I can't do that, and instead I have to hold up a red, green, or blue card indicating one of 3 different personalities, and then the DM decides for me what my character says based on a list of lines he's written up. That would be a terrible way to run a game, and yet that's what dialogue wheels impose upon players. Obviously, a video game can't allow players to have their characters say whatever they like, but at least when I have the exact line of dialogue written out before me, there's no ambiguity. With a dialogue wheel, the player is effectively straitjacketed into choosing among a small number of canned personalities, rather than having that personality emerge naturally from their dialogue choices. Dragon Age 2 actually elevates this to a gameplay mechanic. The game keeps track of whatever Hawke's dominant personality is, which is either diplomatic, sarcastic, or aggressive, and each of these responses is oh so helpfully indicated with a little icon so the player doesn't even have to think about what they're choosing. And why would you even want to think about it anyway, considering that the words on the wheel don't resemble what Hawke says in the slightest? Even the romance options are marked with a little heart icon, so pursuing a relationship requires absolutely no thought whatsoever on the player's part. It's also incredibly mindless. And if you want to play as someone outside of the categories the developers have laid out for you, well, you can certainly try at the cost of your character sounding downright bipolar, swinging from diplomatic niceties one moment to frothing at the mouth rage at another. In Mass Effect, players are clearly expected to go either full Paragon or full Renegade, which is even enforced by the game mechanics, because starting with the second game, your persuasion and intimidation skills were linked to how many Paragon or Renegade responses you had chosen, and if you tried to go for a mixture of both, then you'd eventually reach a point where you just didn't have enough of either to pass a speech check. The result of all this is that your character in these games occupies an unhappy middle ground between a predetermined player character that you might find in a typical JRPG and a Western-style RPG where the player character begins as a blank slate. But what the dialogue wheel really represents is the dismal state of RPGs in the late 2000s and early 2010s. The genre was largely moribund at that time, with 2009's Dragon Age Origins being its last real hurrah. The prevailing attitude seemed to be that RPGs are too niche, too complicated, and too goddamn nerdy to have any mainstream appeal. David Gator, a BioWare veteran and lead writer for the Dragon Age series, stated in an interview with Games Radar that people at Electronic Arts viewed RPG mechanics as being slow and cumbersome, and that they belonged in a cave. The cave, he explains, was where nerds went. The nerds were in the cave. You made an RPG, and the nerds in the cave would always show up for an RPG because it was an RPG. He went on to say that you didn't have to try and appeal to them. You had to worry about the people who weren't in the cave, which was the audience we actually wanted, which was much larger. It's no surprise then that what we got from companies like BioWare and Bethesda were pseudo-RPGs, games that play like shooters or action-adventure titles while still maintaining a flimsy pretense of being RPGs. And that's exactly what the dialogue wheel is, an attempt to convince you that you are playing a character you have created, when in reality you're doing nothing of the sort. They are the quick time events of dialogue, a shallow mechanic designed to create the illusion of interactivity in what is largely non-interactive material. And while I can't say that the dialogue wheel is completely dead, it's definitely on its way out, with Dragon Age Veilguard being the last major RPG to use it. And the failure of Veilguard combined with the success of Baldur's Gate 3, a game that married traditional RPG mechanics with modern production values, feels like closing the casket on the whole pseudo-RPG genre, dialogue wheel included. And all I can say is, good riddance.